Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video I want to talk about Chocobo Mystery Dungeon Everybody. Now this is a remaster of a game that released back in 2007 on the Wii, which I believe was also re-released on the Nintendo DS at some point, and has now been re-released for the PS4 and Switch, as we said earlier. It is a roguelike dungeon crawler focused around the character Chocobo, and his adventures trying to save people. We're not going to get too much into the plot in this video, but it's a game that I feel like a lot of people relate it to certain other titles, which we'll talk about here, and I've been loving it, and I just wanted to share that experience with all of you. So at its core, Chocobo Mystery Dungeon might sound like a familiar concept and even a familiar name. A lot of people, as I've been streaming this game, have been comparing it to the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon that released back in 2005. Now, it's worth saying that Mystery Dungeon is a genre all in itself, and the company that makes these games have been making them for decades, going all the way back to the late 80s and 90s, especially where the original Chocobo Dungeon actually released. So while it's not technically a new thing and it's not copying Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, it's all being made with the same concept and genre, it is something that you may or may not be familiar with. And if you're a fan of those types of roguelike dungeon crawlers, it's really going to be no different here, because at its core, that's what it's good at. As we said earlier, the story focuses around Chocobo. That's his name, despite us Final Fantasy XIV people probably just referring to him as Alpha, as this exact Chocobo made an appearance in Final Fantasy XIV in recent years as part of the Omega series. And yes, Omega is in this game, and yes, you can recruit him as a friend. But Chocobo Mystery Dungeon Everybody is just a solid roguelike. You know, I've always been a big fan of that franchise. I've always looked at games that have things such as permadeath, or losing all items, or starting over all over again, looking back to things like Rogue Legacy and Darkest Dungeon, and all sorts of various games. This was my first Mystery Dungeon game, and I'm kind of disappointed with myself, because these are games I would have been loving all these years. I'd seen them maybe for rental at a video store growing up, but I never really made the jump, because it was just like a game focused around a Chocobo? Is it a little too cutesy for me? Is the story a little bit naive? Yeah, but it doesn't really matter, because the game itself is pretty fun. There's a lot of collection aspects, the combat can get very, very intense, especially against some of the stronger boss-type enemies, and the dungeon exploration can be as nerve-wracking as any other roguelike that you may be used to. Now, the gameplay will see you delve through various dungeons that can be either short with very specific rule sets, or very long, challenging your ability to maintain resources and to kind of fight your greed. Because it is a roguelike, it does focus on a lot of the more old school elements. You have a limited inventory that can gradually expand throughout the game. You will lose all the items not equipped to you when you die, if you die in the middle of a dungeon. And if you're on hard mode, not only are the enemies harder, but you'll even lose the weapons that are equipped. So managing your bank and how much gil you have saved up, and making sure you bring the right items for the right scenario, being willing to accept maybe a death or two as part of the learning experience. It's something that this game is synonymous with, and despite its friendly, childlike demeanor, is something that should not be taken lightly. Even on the normal difficulty, if you think you're just gonna breeze through it no problem without a proper strategy, you'd be wrong. Some of the bosses are gonna test your positioning, some of them are gonna test your ability to deal with RNG bull. And that's as much as I'm going to say with that, because I've dealt with some terrible things on Leviathan in particular. But there's all sorts of different things that you can really enjoy about this if you're a fan of roguelikes. Something new to everybody from the previous re-releases and original release of the Chocobo Mystery Dungeon game back in 2007 is that you get to bring these buddies along with you to make the experience, I guess, a little bit more player-friendly. The buddies don't offer too much in terms of actual power outside of the early game, but there is so much variety between who you can bring, what kind of rule sets they have, what kind of resistances they have. They can cover for a weakness of one of the jobs that the Chocobo themselves has picked up, or you can just use them as a backup healer in case you happen to take too much damage. On top of that, if you actually have a friend to play with, it does couch co-op. Your friend can take a second controller and choose the very limited actions that that buddy will actually take. It does improve the buddy experience, and while the buddy never gets to be nearly as powerful as the main character, having that extra support structure of that second player or of that CPU ally definitely is better than going in alone like the original games would have had you do. Just be careful, because as you're going throughout these dungeons, your positioning inside of them is going to be very important. There are traps hidden under the ground that may jump you, enemies that can move and attack twice as many times per turn due to their speed stat, and using your buddy to block these attacks or scout out certain areas, and also trying to make sure that they kind of don't accidentally step on an explosive trap and take half of your current health. All of these things can be pretty important, so you want to make sure that you're actually approaching these dungeons in an intelligent way, even with the positioning of your buddy. The items you find in the dungeon are pretty varied. There's of course basic potions that restore your HP and your SP, which I guess you could refer to as MP in this game. You can bring a variety of weapons and armors to get all sorts of different resistances, change the type of attack that you have, give yourself some extra range. You really want to be carrying certain things for certain scenarios, and while you'll probably work your way through the story with a generic powerful setup, especially if you're playing on normal mode, if you wish to tackle the game's post-game content, you're gonna have to be a lot smarter about the way you think about approaching these dungeons. You can actually grow flowers outside in your garden, which can give you special effects in the dungeon, whether it be a few job points to level up that job that you want to start playing, or maybe provide you protect and shell, confuse all the enemies around you. You can also pick up spell books, which can give you one-time use of various spells, which comes in handy in case you may need a sleep or a protect or a shell, and you're not otherwise equipped to deal with it. On top of that, you can even kick items in order to deal those effects to enemies or even the allies that you have. You can kick an X potion at your buddy in order to heal them, since they otherwise really wouldn't have many options. You can kick an explosive potion at an enemy in order to deal damage. So just because an item's laying in the ground and your inventory is full, doesn't mean you can't use it or kick it right off the ground and give it some additional oomph. Outside the dungeon is a basic town like you would see in pretty much any RPG. You can purchase some basic things, get upgrades for your inventory, store some gil away at the bank, and you're going to notice some Final Fantasy references across that. There's also a ton of townsfolk, which can actually give you access to additional dungeons, which may give you access to new jobs or new story aspects or even new shops altogether. Now, just to be clear, while I did make comparisons to games like Rogue Legacy and Darkest Dungeon, this isn't going to be a crazy, insane, difficult game. You're going to find that you spend a lot of time grinding specific enemies and bosses in order to earn buddy points, which are actually the things that let you unlock these various buddies. You may find that you want to grind out gil or specific upgrades that you may want out of various areas, maybe the ability to hone your items up to a really high value, or to give yourself immunity to certain status effects before you go into that next dungeon. There's all sorts of playability through your first playthrough, but there's no guarantee that you're really going to want to replay this game immediately upon completing it. It's probably something you'll tuck away and play maybe on an off day sometime a year from now. But the amount of time that you'll actually get out of your first playthrough is more than adequate for a game like this. You know, I've probably put 30 to 40 hours into it, and that has been going at a relatively reasonable pace without going too crazy hardcore at trying to complete the story super fast. So who knows, you may get twice as much time out of that, especially if you're grinding out to do the super dungeon that has 100 floors towards the later part of the game. There's all sorts of different ways to go about enjoying it, and all sorts of completion aspects that you may or may not be interested in. Overall, for a price tag of $40, I'd say it was well worth it. Of course, you're not exactly buying this game for the super in-depth story or the high-end graphics. You're very much buying it for the roguelike experience, and of course it being a very Final Fantasy-centric game. OSTs from Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy XI, Final Fantasy VII, all sorts of different titles from the franchise, with a few remixes thrown in there, are all very welcome, and if you're nostalgic for those kind of things, you'll probably enjoy the hell out of this game. But overall, I can give it a recommendation. I very much like to play the other mystery dungeons, the non-Chocobo ones at this point, but if you're someone who's a big fan of these types of games, give it a try, especially if you're maybe waiting for that next game to come out and you got $40 to throw at something else. Anyway, if you've been playing Chocobo Mystery Dungeon, let me know what you thought. Hopefully you've been enjoying it as much as I have. Still need to finish it, like I said, only about halfway through the game, plus I got the post-game stuff to deal with as well. So let me know what you think and things I should be looking forward to, the hell that is coming forward. Anyway, be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned. I've got some other videos for some other games coming up over the next week or so. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.